Okay, so we're talking about JavaScript debugging. And this is a term that refers to figuring out why your code isn't working. So when we're writing code, there's a lot of errors that we can run into just from like simple, like forgetting how to spell a function or missing a comma somewhere, something like that. And there's more complex problems that we run into if we're, adding numbers or doing math that isn't working out the way that we expect it to. And so debugging is the practice of trying to figure out what those issues are. And having a basic understanding of debugging will make learning coding a lot less painful, because a lot of times when you're first learning to code, you'll hit the play button and nothing happens, or it doesn't look like what you want it to look like. And if you don't have a sense of why that's happening or how to fix it, it can be very frustrating. So that's why we're going to talk about debugging. For a little bit of history, the term computer bug was coined by Grace Hopper, who was a programmer, I think for the U.S. Army, or like some, let's see, Navy, yeah, in the 40s and 50s, I think. And she logged this bug that was actually like physically in the computer. And it was causing a problem because, back at that time, computers were these big electrical and mechanical operations, and the bug was actually making one of the transistors misfire, and it was creating a problem with the program that they didn't understand why it was working. And so that's actually where the term bug comes from. When you say you have a bug in your code, it comes from this like literal bug that was found in an old computer. And it's been adopted more generally to mean that your computer program isn't doing what you want it to do. And there can be various reasons why that might happen. So one thing to note about JavaScript, and I've talked a little bit about how JavaScript is a little weird this semester, how it differs from other programming languages. It's one of the things with the philosophy behind JavaScript is it wants to be sort of approachable. It wants to be easier for new developers to be able to use. And so one of the ways that they do that is that they don't have very many fatal errors. And in JavaScript, in programming in general, a fatal error means your program just stops running. Nothing happens. So fatal errors are, you won't see anything happening in your code, but usually, that's a good sign, or it's sort of like useful feedback to know that your code isn't running. When you have non-fatal errors, that means it's doing something that it's not supposed to do, but it's still going to run the program because it's not like destroying the whole program. So in JavaScript, there's a lot of non-fatal errors, and that makes it harder to know when you're having an error. So that's one of the things that we have to be aware of with JavaScript. So we're in the console again. If you want to follow along, you can use Command-Alt-J on Mac or Control-Shift-J on Windows, or you can right-click and go to Inspect, or find the console in all the various ways. And so we're just going to create some bugs and just talk about what they mean. So there's a few bugs that you'll run into. So if I try to write a JavaScript statement, x plus 1, and I just hit enter, I get this bug called reference error. X is not defined. And so this error is telling me that I'm trying to use something called x, but I haven't created x yet. I haven't said what x is or that it exists. So there's a couple ways I can solve that bug. I could just say var x. Well, I guess, yeah, I was going to do that anyway, equals 1. And now I can say x plus 1. And it'll give me a value. So I can declare x, and then that statement will work. So a lot of times if you see that uncaught reference error, that means that you have a variable that you haven't assigned, or you haven't declared it, or some other issue like that. So this is just part of the process of debugging, writing your code, trying to run it, looking at the errors that you get, and then going back to see how you can fix it. One thing that I think is, this is sort of a more soft approach to debugging. It's not a technical skill, but I think one thing to kind of keep in mind when you're writing code is that it can be frustrating when you write code and it doesn't work, but you don't know why it doesn't work. So I see a lot of people, delete their code, or completely close things or, get mad about stuff. And one thing that's really hard to remember to do, but will really help you as you spend more time coding, is to just, when you see a bug or you see an error and you don't know what it's for, just like take a break, go somewhere else, and then come back to it. I can't, I've spent, I've been coding for a very long time, and I've spent a lot of staying up all night trying to find one bug, and then I finally leave, and then I come back the next day and realize that it was like the dumbest thing that could have possibly happened. So it's hard to keep that in mind, but it's a good thing to try to do. So a couple steps when you're debugging. These are just suggestions. So start with just asking, what did I expect to happen, and what happened instead? So a lot of students, when they first start programming, they'll say it doesn't work, or nothing happened, or I don't see anything. And so that's, if something's not working the way it's supposed to, you need to think about, what did you expect to happen? So you expected to see some circles, or you expected to see some math happen, and then what's happening instead, and start to think about why that might be the case. So then the next step, obviously, is to check the console. If there's an error message, that'll be a good sort of hint or pointer that will help you start looking at where that bug is and how you can fix it. This will help you with technical issues like syntax problems or misspellings or things like that. But it's not going to help you with conceptual gaps. This is when you have an idea for what you want, and you don't have an error, but you don't see what you want. That's a different type of issue. It might not be a technical bug, but it might be that you're using numbers that don't match. You have a canvas that's 400 by 400, and you have a circle that's sitting over at 800, so you don't see it. And so it's a conceptual issue rather than a technical issue. So if you open the console and you see an error, then there's an error. I can go fix it. If you don't see an error, then okay, I have to think about what is happening in my code that's not doing what I want. The error will usually tell you what line it is in your code. So we don't see that with the console because we don't have a script, but we can see that with our example in a second. So another thing that you can use is console.log. And we haven't used this, I don't know if we've used this at all yet this semester, but it's a really useful function where you can log messages to your console. And you can log lots of different type of stuff. So if you have a variable and something's not doing what you want it to do, you can log it to see maybe it's not the right value, or maybe it's undefined or something like that. So if you want to log anything in your console, you can say console.log, and then you can put a variable. It'll tell you the value of that variable. You can also put a message like, why is this not running? And to see, this is pretty silly, but I put that a lot in my code. If the code's not doing what I want, one of the first things I looked for is my script even running? Sometimes you forgot to attach the script, or it didn't load or something like that. So sometimes I'm just logging something just to see if it's working. So that's a good function to use. It's just console.log. There's other aspects of the console that are kind of useful as well. Like you can say console.dir. This is probably, we haven't really talked about objects yet, so this probably won't make that much sense. But if I say console.dir, I can use the document. It'll tell me what's available inside the document. So there's a few other functions that you can use there, but console.log is kind of the main one. Another thing with console.log is that you can log multiple things. So I can log hello, and then I can put a comma, and put X, and then put a number, and it'll log all of that stuff for me. So I can write out messages to myself that will only appear in the console, but not appear on the actual sketch or code that I'm writing. So research is another place to start. Stack Overflow is where you're going to find a lot of stuff that will help you. So, there's a ton of JavaScript stuff. If I just look up JavaScript here, it's going to ask me if I'm a human being. You can see there's over 2 million questions about JavaScript. And you know, there's really sometimes you'll find like really specific things that you would never think were on here. Like we could probably even look for P5. Like if I say P5 variable undefined, see if it has, yeah, so there's some P5 stuff in here. Although it has to do with, yeah, so you'll see stuff like this, like somebody asking a question, they give an example of their code, you can look at the code and say, does that look like what I'm trying to do or not? And then people will answer it, and you can also vote on it, so, you know, the answers will have different votes. The person who wrote the question can accept an answer, that's what that little green check means. So going to Stack Overflow is, in some cases, going to be more a faster tool than Google. If you Google something like a similar question, like if I say JavaScript P5 variable undefined, probably the first result, although I was just on that page, so maybe that's why, but you can see early results are like a lot of Stack Overflow. There's some other stuff in here, but Stack Overflow is often going to be the first thing that you see if you're Googling some code. One thing that you have to remember is that it's not reading your code. So for example, if you have a variable called my variable, other people might not have that variable in their code. So you have to think about what the generic error is, not necessarily the specific error when you're doing research. So that's something to keep in mind. Asking a friend, that's always a good thing to try. Obviously, you know, you can ask me, but you know, you could go on Discord and say, I'm getting this error, and maybe one of you guys will have seen it before and can answer, you know, before I can. But asking other people to look at your code is always a good idea. Some people will see things that you don't see because you've been writing the code the whole time. Take a break, as I mentioned before. If you can't figure it out, don't sit there for 2 hours. Like I always have students being like, oh, I didn't finish this project because I spent 6 hours like debugging, or I spent 6 hours trying to figure out this error. And I'm like, I literally told you not to spend time debugging. If you can't get an error, just ask me. If you've been spending an hour on one problem and it's not working, that's too long. It's time to take a break and ask somebody, or just do something else for a while. All right, don't delete your code. Make sure you're editing the right file. This isn't going to be an issue so much for us this semester because we're using the P5 editor. But before the editor existed, we used to have everything on local files. And that was like probably 95% of people's errors, is that they were editing a file, but then they had a copy of their project somewhere else. And so they were editing a file that wasn't actually being run on their browser. And, you know, it's just like, if you don't realize that that's what you're doing, it's impossible to figure out that that's the issue. I basically have the console open all the time. This is another thing that's a little bit different with using the editor. Let me open the editor real quick. So usually if you're just working from files, there's no built-in console, right? So when I'm writing code, I don't, you know, usually if I'm working on a website, I'm just debugging using Chrome, and I have the console open basically the entire time I'm working. I pretty much never have it closed. With the P5 editor, they actually have the console built into the interface down here. So you don't necessarily need to also have the console open over here, but there are actually some differences that you may notice between the two, so it could be useful to have it open sometimes. Console.log we already talked about, so we can keep going. And some common errors that you'll run into in P5 or in JavaScript in general. A syntax error is when you have just some code that's out of place. So for example, if I say like variable x and then I want to say equals, but I forgot the equal sign and I just say 1, I'm going to get a syntax error because I created a variable, but then I didn't use the assignment operator or some other operator. So that's going to tell me I have a syntax error. Reference error is the one that we saw before. If I say like y plus 1, I'm going to get an uncaught reference error. Failed to load resource. I don't know, I can't demonstrate this, but this is if you're trying to load like an image, but the image isn't in the right place or it doesn't exist or something like that. You'll see a failed to load resource. And then NaN is not a number. You probably won't actually see that all that often, but if I try to do something like hello times 10, it's going to tell me NaN. So it's going to say I can't do this because you're trying to do something with multiplier that's not a number. So that's when I'll see NaN, not a number. So that brings us to our debug challenge. So you can see here, I have this sketch that I'm going to share with you guys. And this is what it looks like if it doesn't have any bugs. And so your job is to fix the bugs so that you get this sketch. So I'll put it in the Discord, but you can also see it here under week 3, the debugging exercise. If you click that, it'll bring you to my copy of the exercise. And what you should do on your P5, let me log in real quick. So when you open this on your P5, you should just make a copy. So you can say duplicate, or you can say save, and save your own copy of it. And then you can work through the bugs until you get the image. And there's also a link to the image here. So it doesn't have to look exactly right, but it should look pretty close to this. Depending on what approach you take to fixing things, it may look a little bit different. But that's basically what it should look like. And yeah, a couple things. There's no draw function. And the reason why that is, we haven't really talked about that this much. We haven't talked about the draw function very much because we haven't gotten to our interaction area yet. But if you have the draw function in there, it's going to be running the code over and over and over again. And so it's going to be spamming the console with a ton of error messages, and that's going to be kind of annoying. But if we just have the setup function, you'll see that I can run it, and I do have some errors, but it's only running the program once, so I just have one error. So that's why there's no draw function, but it works. You don't need a draw function for this program. And then, yeah, the other thing to mention is that there is a console in P5 which you can use. Usually there is going to be a little message that tells you where to find the error. So this says it's sketch.js, and then the first number there is 19. That's what line it's on. So if I look at that error, it says missing parentheses after argument list at sketch.js, line 19. So I'll go to line 19, and I'll take a look at that and try to figure out what I'm missing on that line. And if you go through and start to solve the bugs, once I solve that bug, it's just going to go to the next bug. Another thing that you'll notice once you get a few bugs fixed is that there are some hints that P5 actually gives you that are not part of general JavaScript. So there'll be times when the error message that you see in the console over here is actually different from what's in the console over here. So that's actually going to make it easier for you to debug this project in particular. But that's good. You know, they built in those tools to make it easier to use. So I think that's enough to get started. You guys can work on that for however long you need. If you have questions, let me know and I'll take a look. I think you should be able to finish it in class today, but the due date is next Monday, so you have some more time if you can't finish it. And as I mentioned before, if you finish it and you have like lots of time left in class, you can work on your self-portrait variables assignment. So it looks like you guys are all starting to work on it. So I'm just gonna